Audio recording for this meeting has begun.
Hello again. I see a few more people are joining us. As you enter the room, feel free to drop your name, location, and organization in the chat. So you're joining, and we'll be getting started in just a few minutes as more people join. Welcome. Thank you all so much for coming. Joining. As you come in, feel free to continue just dropping your name, your location, and organization as you are joining. We are so excited to have you with us today. Feel free to keep dropping your name, location, and organization in the chat as you are coming in. All right, we're going to get started in just a minute. Welcome to everyone who is joining. Thank you so much for being with us today. Welcome to everyone who's joining. Feel free to keep dropping your name, location, and organization in the chat. We're going to get started in just a moment. All right. All right, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for everyone who is with us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. Alana, if you could just go to the next slide. Welcome to our Non-Discrimination in Housing Programs webinar. So this webinar is brought to you by the Freedom Network Training Institute Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project, funded by the Office for Victims of Crime. We provide training and technical assistance to service providers working with survivors of human trafficking. We host quarterly webinars on topics related to the intersection of housing and human trafficking. And we also have a resource library with fact sheets and webinar recordings, and you can find all of that at freedomnetworkusa.org. And you can also sign up for our listserv to receive notifications. Just a little bit about Freedom Network USA. We are a nationwide coalition of direct service providers, survivors, and advocates addressing human trafficking through a rights-based approach in the United States. So just some basic housekeeping to get out of the way before we go ahead and get started. We do have live closed captioning available for you today, and you should be able to find that on the top of your screen through that little CC button that you should be able to click. You can find your chat on the bottom right hand of your screen, and feel free to engage throughout our session today. We would love to hear from all of the expertise that is represented in this space. And you can also find on the right hand of your screen additional resources and a copy of today's slide deck that you can download and follow along with if you're interested. In about 2 weeks, you will receive a recording of today's session, and all of those attached materials will be emailed to you. And throughout today's session, if you need assistance with anything, feel free to raise your hand, and you can find that bottom at the top of your screen as well. Finally, we will be putting in a Q&A box. Feel free to drop in any questions throughout today's presentation, as we will have time to answer those questions at the end of today's presentation. And we can go to the next slide, Alana. All right, awesome. So leading our webinar today is Tammy Baxter, Attorney Advisor from the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Justice, and Chris Ash, Survivor Leadership Program Manager at CAST LA. And if you're interested in reading more about them, you can find their full bios in your registration email. And we can go to Alana. Fantastic. So during our webinar today, we'll be View of how housing programs can successfully employ non-discrimination practices, and we'll also be having a discussion of the protected classes covered underneath housing. And finally, we'll be providing some practical examples of how to implement non-discrimination practices in housing programs. So we're super excited for all of this amazing content, and without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Tammy to begin our presentation. Tammy, I believe you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Again, my name is Tammy Baxter. I'm an attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Justice Programs, Office for Civil Rights. And I was invited here today to provide some civil rights training to those of you in the audience who are recipients of grant awards from the Department of Justice and its Office for Victims of Crime. Today's training will go over those civil rights laws and obligations that attach to grant recipients and which they must comply upon receipt of the funding and then OVC has asked that I provide a condensed version of the normal civil rights training that my office typically provides so that we can stay within the allotted time frame today. I mention this because I'll be providing the highlights and moving through the materials quite quickly. However, I also provided a number of resource links that have been included with this webinar that you'll have access to, and I strongly encourage you to do this as well so that those grant recipients and attendants have all the important and vital information they need to understand to ensure their compliance with grant awards from the Department of Justice and OVC. And I would just ask that you hold those until the end of the presentation. And many of these presentations are years to literally thousands of grantees. We learned along the way that questions can be quite fact-specific, dependent on the grant and the services or programs being provided with that grant. I mention this now because if I provide an answer that seems quite general, it may be that we will need to connect following the presentation so that I can gather all the really important details about your scenario and provide you the best recommendations for compliance with your grant award and those funds. With that said, we're going to jump right in. I'll be moving through the slides quite briskly just to make sure we stay within the time frames and we have enough time for the next presenter and then to take questions. So let's start with the Office for Civil Rights, my office, in what that office does in connection with you as the grant recipient, and then our role within the Department of Justice and the Office of Justice Programs. So the Office for Civil Rights is an administrative enforcement office located within the Office of Justice Programs. And for those of you who may not know, the Office of Justice Programs is the grant-making division of the Department of Justice. That is where all of the grants that come out of DOJ originate flows through the program offices, such as the OVC. OCR is responsible then for ensuring that grant recipients from any of the program offices at the Department of Justice, whether that be the COPS office, the Office on Violence Against Women, or the Office for Victims of Crime, and there are several others, making sure that those grantees are complying with the applicable federal civil rights laws and requirements that attach to that grant award. In terms of how we actually carry out our work and we conduct administrative enforcement of grantees, we have 4 primary tools that we use. The first would be technical assistance. Essentially, this training today. We provide numerous trainings to grantees, their employees, as well as customers, clients, or beneficiaries of those grant awards or those funded services being provided by DOJ grant. In this context, OBC grants. And so we provide technical assistance, ensure that grantees are aware of those civil rights obligations that they agreed to upon taking those grant awards. Another administrative enforcement tool that our office uses to ensure grantee compliance comes through our complaint process. And so this is where we generally get a lot of questions.
Tammy, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Your audio is very crackly. If you wouldn't mind, I'm just going off video. I think that may help with the audio. That way everyone can hear this great information.
Okay, so I didn't quite hear. What adjustment would you like?
Oh, if you wouldn't mind just with the audio, yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, is that better?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, no problem. I apologize for that. As I was saying, so the Office for Civil Rights ensures that grantees are complying with their civil rights laws and obligations that are attaching to receipt of those grant funds. And so we enforce those obligations in a number of ways. One is providing the training, such as what we're doing here today. Another is through reviewing complaints of discrimination that actually come to our office and maybe presenting allegations against a grantee. And those allegations could come from a grantee's employees or recipients of the DOJ-funded services. When we receive those complaints, we review all the allegations within, and we serve as an independent fact finder, determining the facts and then whether or not there had been an issue of noncompliance by the grantee. If we do determine that there is an issue of noncompliance with the civil rights laws and obligations that are attaching to that grant award, we work with the grantee to rectify those. We engage in what we refer to as voluntary compliance, helping the grantee overcome the deficiency in their compliance with their civil rights laws and obligations to ensure that those important grant funds continue to flow to the grantee so that they can continue to provide the important services that that grant is funding. Another tool that we use to ensure grantee compliance is what we refer to as compliance reviews. Compliance reviews are a very broad-based, large investigation of a grantee and all of its elements, organizational structure, programs, and practices and policies that could be focusing on a specific issue with regard to their funding. So, for example, we could be looking at a grantee who may present issues with employment discrimination. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we could be looking at all of the programs and activities of a grantee that may have concerns with providing discriminatory services to clients, customers, or beneficiaries with those DOJ grant funds. The final enforcement tool that the OCR has is what we refer to as Equal Employment Opportunity Plans, or EEOPs. EEOPs are essentially a snapshot of a grantee's workforce, and it provides a breakdown of the workforce as compared to those available in the community to actually fill the available positions. The breakdown is by race, color, national origin, and sex, and among 7 different equal employment opportunity categories. Not every grantee is required to submit an EEOP, but those that are do submit those to OCR for review and approval. I have included a resource list regarding EEOPs that is contained within this webinar, and it'll give you much more detail that we don't have time to go into today. And of course, my office is available to answer any questions that you may have about whether or not you need to submit an EEOP as a condition of your grant award, or if you do, questions in preparing that. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what laws does the OCR enforce, and what are those laws that grantees must comply with as a recipient of funding from the Department of Justice? Well, there's a series of those, and you'll see those on your screen. The first is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And Title VI prohibits discrimination based on race, color, and national origin. Next is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and that prohibits discrimination based on disability. Similarly, there's Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which also prohibits discrimination based on disability. A note about Title II is that it applies to everyone, regardless of whether or not you're actually receiving a grant award. So while Section 504 was specifically designed for recipients of grant funding, Title II is what we consider a cross-cutting legal statute, and it applies to all entities, regardless of whether or not you actually receive federal funding. Next slide, please. The next law that recipients of DOJ funding must comply is the Age Discrimination Act of 1975, and that prohibits discrimination based on age in the context of services that you are providing. There is another law that prohibits discrimination based on age in employment practices, and the OCR does not have direct jurisdiction over that law. Another office within the Department of Justice would be able to review complaints of discrimination involving that law. Next is Title IX of the Education Amendment, and that prohibits discrimination based on sex in educational programs. And under this particular law, sex does include sexual orientation and gender identity. And then there are the specific program statutes which grantees must comply depending on what program office they've received their funding. So in this context, the program statutes may provide comprehensive protections similar to all the other laws that we've just discussed, or they may craft out different areas of protection. We'll be talking more specifically about the Victims of Crime Act, which is applicable when grantees are receiving funds from OVC. Next slide, please. So collectively, all of those laws afford protection to certain groups of individuals, or what we refer to under the law as protected classes. Those laws prohibit discrimination based on race, the protected class of color, national origin, which contains a subtopic of limited English proficiency, religion, disability, age, and sex. And that may also include sexual orientation and gender identity. Next slide, please. In addition to the coverage of protected classes and the prohibition of discrimination against those protected classes, that also extends to both employment practices and or the delivery of services or the provision of services to the grantees, customers, clients, or beneficiaries. Next slide, please. So who's subject to these laws? Well, quite simply, it's any DOJ-funded program or activity. If you are receiving grant funds from the Department of Justice, you are subject to these laws. Program or activity can mean all of your organization's operations, such as an entire department or office within a state or local government receiving the grant. Financial assistance is more than just the grant award. It can also include anything that you purchased with that grant. Say, for example, equipment, the provision of training to your staff, any facilities that were constructed. It's important to remember that when you're receiving grant funds from the Department of Justice, you now have civil rights laws and obligations for compliance that attach to that grant. And it can include, again, not only the grant award, but anything that flowed from from that grant and that you purchased with those grant funds. One other important note is that any grantee receiving DOJ funding must also require any of its subrecipients to comply with all applicable civil rights laws and regulations regarding non-discrimination. So if you receive a primary grant from OVC and your organization then funnels or subgrants out that money to other organizations, in effect making a subaward, you as the primary grantee are responsible for ensuring that the subrecipient is complying with all of the applicable civil rights laws and requirements that have attached to that grant award. Next slide, please. So let's look at a couple examples to kind of put this initial information together. In the first example, if a shelter, a housing program, or a rape crisis center receives DOJ funding and then uses the funds to operate a particular project or program, all of the activities of the organization are covered and not just the DOJ funded project. In another example, if a project of a county sheriff's department receives federal funds, the entire sheriff's department is covered, but not every other department within the county. Next slide. So I'm going to provide a scenario, and we're going to kind of tack together the protected classes and then an example of discrimination in the delivery of services. In this example, I would ask the audience to respond in your chat with what type of protected class you believe is involved in this scenario. And I'll read that to you. A domestic violence shelter has a blanket policy of only providing services to female victims of domestic violence and not male victims. If you could take a moment to consider the example and then respond in the chat at what protected class are we talking about here that is involved in the alleged discrimination. I see an answer coming up, and so if we're talking about the distinction between females and males, the protected class of discrimination involved would be sex. And we actually see this scenario quite frequently, and we receive quite a number of questions from grantees as well as customers and clients who may have experienced a situation similar to this. And so, again, we're dealing with the protected class of sex discrimination, and this particular shelter has a blanket policy of only providing services to female victims, but not male victims. When presented with this scenario, we would explain to the grantee that this is problematic and offer them suggestions for compliance. One suggestion for compliance would be to house male victims on a separate floor or in a separate facility. Another suggestion is to arrange housing for male clients at a nearby hotel or shelter that has the capacity to house men. These suggestions are made because it's important that regardless of the blanket policy, as a recipient of federal funding, the shelter has an obligation to provide those services to both males and females, and they cannot favor one category over the other. So the solution to ensure compliance would be to provide those alternate housing arrangements, but also at the same time ensure that they are providing the same services to both their female victims and their male victims. And those services could include the counseling, the advocacy, and so on and so forth. Next slide. Now we're going to talk just briefly about the protected class of disability discrimination. And the highlight here for grantees to be mindful of is that Recipients of DOJ funding must provide reasonable accommodations to the known physical or mental limitations of an otherwise qualified individual with a disability, unless a grant recipient can demonstrate that it would be an undue hardship or would fundamentally alter the service or activity. It's important to note with regard to disability discrimination that every case requires an individual analysis by the DOJ grant recipient, and individuals who are requesting a reasonable accommodation, even with a shared disability, are not a homogeneous group. So individual analysis is extremely important when you as the grant recipient are being approached and you have either an employee or a customer, client, or beneficiary attempting to access your funded services and accommodation is being requested. Next slide, please. So let's take a scenario here, and we're going to take a look about this. Disability discrimination in the context, again, of services. In this scenario, an organization receives VOCA funds to operate a transitional housing program for human trafficking survivors. The organization has, again, a blanket policy that residents cannot take any prescribed psychotropic medication while staying at the home. I'd like the audience to tell me, by responding in the chat, whether or not you believe that the blanket policy that the shelter has in place is acceptable. Next slide, please. And one more. Well, if we break down this scenario, the policy actually would not be acceptable. And again, this is another scenario that the Office for Civil Rights has provided compliance recommendations to DOJ funding recipients. The issue here is that by having a blanket exclusionary policy, the organization has now discriminated against individuals who may have a mental disability that may also be controlled by medication. In this case, under the applicable federal civil rights laws, the grant recipient does have an obligation to conduct an individualized assessment of this individual to ensure that they are not treating them differently or denying them access to funded programs or services because of their disability. Next slide. The next protected class that we're going to speak about for a few minutes is that of religion. And there's both religious discrimination and then a subtopic within that which addresses faith-based organizations. With regard to religion and religious discrimination, that's defined generally as all aspects of religious practice as well as belief. It also includes sincerely held moral or ethical beliefs. Within the context of religious discrimination, the Department of Justice has also developed and published specific regulations regarding organizations defined as faith-based organizations. Because, again, we have a short time frame today, we don't have enough time to get into all the specifics with regard to faith-based organizations, but I have included a resource link which provides in-depth information that is specific to you as a grantee if you are an FBO. 2 points to mention is that the DOJ regulations for faith-based organizations state that government agencies such as the Department of Justice must remove barriers for FBOs applying for federal aid. And also government agencies providing that financial assistance must not discriminate either in favor of or against faith-based organizations. Next slide. So we're going to try another scenario, and again, following our our protected class of religion, we're going to focus on that. And I'm going to ask the group, again, another poll question following the scenario. In the first scenario, an atheist participant in a sexual assault survivor support group run by a funded faith-based organization is required to participate in an opening prayer session before the group begins. In the second scenario, a young woman seeking services at a local domestic violence shelter is told not to use her prayer rug in her room while she is a resident of the shelter. In your opinion, are the practices in these scenarios acceptable? Great. So some of us have some familiarity with the protected class of religion and prohibited discrimination. I see a resounding response of no, and that's absolutely correct. And we can discuss why on the next slide. In the first scenario, it's an example of an impermissible requirement to participate in religious exercises or program with faith content. In the second scenario, it was an example of a denial of access to religious services, pastoral counselor, special dietary needs, or items of a person's faith, such as the prayer. Next slide. The next protected class we're going to speak a few minutes about is that of national origin. And within national origin, you may recall at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that that included a subtopic or a subcategory of limited English proficiency, or LEP. A limited English proficient person has a first language other than English and a limited ability to read, speak, write, or understand English. Because this is quite an extensive topic, I've also included a resource link that gives you all the information that you need to know and specifics with regard to providing services to individuals who may be LEP, and also responsibilities as a grantee that you may have in developing language access plans to ensure that you have policies and procedures in place to meet your LEP community needs. On the next slide, we'll go over a quick scenario of what it means to provide meaningful access to your customers, clients, or beneficiaries who are seeking DOJ-funded services from you and who may be LEP. I'm going to ask you again if you could let me know, following the scenarios, whether or not the meaningful access was provided to the individuals involved in each scenario. And the first, a shelter automatically sends all Spanish-speaking intakes to another organization that specializes in providing services to the Hispanic community. In the second scenario, a police officer attempts to question a victim of an assault by using a family member as an interpreter. In the poll, do you believe that meaningful access was afforded to these individuals? Great, thank you for your response. If we could go to the next slide and we'll break down each scenario. And in terms of meaningful access, it absolutely was not provided in either scenario. In the first scenario, it was an example of a failure to provide services, including necessary language assistance services, which could include either oral interpretation or written translation, to ensure access to the shelter's programs based on LEP status. In the second scenario, it was an impermissible use of a family member that may raise issues of competency, confidentiality, or conflict of interest. The resource link that I contain discusses each one of these scenarios and the types of language assistance services, and also the issues of confidentiality and ensuring competency with regard to the use of an interpreter, and why you should not use family members or friends in a scenario such as what was presented on the screen. Next example, please, or excuse me, next slide, please. At the beginning of the presentation, I had mentioned all of the laws that grant recipients must comply when they agree to take funding from the Department of Justice, and in this case, OVC. I had mentioned some of those laws are cross-cutting, meaning they apply regardless of whether or not you receive grant funds and from what office you may receive them. And then I also mentioned that there are program-specific statutes. As OVC recipients, you're probably aware that the OVC as a program office has its own specific statute with regard to civil rights obligations and protections afforded. And so this statute will attach to your receipt of grants from OVC and has an additional layer of requirements for compliance. Next slide, please. In that specific OVC program statute is the Victims of Crime Act. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with that. And the non-discrimination provision within states that no person shall on the ground of race, color, religion, national origin, handicap, or sex be excluded from participation in, denied the benefits of, subjected to discrimination under, or denied employment in connection with any undertaking funded in whole or in part with sums made available under this chapter. The VOCA statute is quite comprehensive. It lists out multiple categories of protections or protected classes of prohibited discrimination, and it applies both in the context of employment practices of a grantee as well as services that they are providing with DOJ funding. Next slide, please. In addition to compliance with all of the federal civil rights laws that we've quickly went over today, as well as the program statutes and some of the other requirements such as the EEOP, grant recipients also have the obligation to not engage in retaliation. DOJ funded recipients could not take an adverse action or, in other words, retaliate against an individual for opposing discrimination. And this would include harassment, demotion, discharge, and denial of services. Next slide. Like everything, COVID-19 has presented a different series of questions and challenges for all of us and how we carry out the work that we did before the pandemic. We received many questions from our grantees and how could they continue to provide their funded services in a non-discriminatory way with some of the challenges that COVID-19 presented. As a result of this, our office published specific guidance for grantees, instructing them that they have a continuing obligation to comply with all applicable federal civil rights laws during COVID-19. Next slide. We went on to state that reminding recipients that they should take steps to ensure that their programs and activities continue to be accessible to individuals covered by civil rights laws. And then we included several examples. The first would be that they should continue providing appropriate aids and services necessary to ensure effective communication with individuals who have disabilities, such as vision, hearing, or speech, notwithstanding the health emergency-related restrictions on visitors. Options that we did present to them included allowing no-contact interpreter sessions. For example, if they needed to provide interpretation, that could be provided by separating with a glass partition or utilizing something like video remote interpreting. Next slide, please. Another example was that grantees have a continuing obligation during the pandemic to ensure meaningful access to programs and information for LEP individuals by maintaining access to qualified interpreters and translation services. and also providing reasonable accommodations to clients with disabilities, including mobility impairments, to ensure that they can perform necessary hygiene measures, for example, hand washing, and still engage in social distancing. I've included our resource link with regard to providing services during the COVID-19 pandemic, and you'll see the published guidance that came out of our office if you were to take a look at that, and it will provide you some helpful information on, if you face any of these challenges, how to continue providing your funded services to ensure compliance. Next slide, please. I've included the contact information for my office, and I believe the Freedom Network is also providing my personal email. Again, I'm really happy that you could attend today. I know this presentation was super brief, and again, I consider it the highlight reel, but for any of you who have heard either myself or one of the other attorneys speak at previous conferences, you know that we're always accessible. We are happy to provide technical assistance to our grantees, their employees, or even any of their clients or beneficiaries who are attempting to access their services and may feel like they have some questions regarding that access. I've also included in our links our website page, and probably most importantly for some are just the expanded version of this training. It's broken down into individual modules discussing each protected class and each of the civil rights obligations that grantees must comply. It's the same online training that is required of all of our grant recipients and which you would have been made aware of in your standard assurances when you took that grant award from the Department of Justice. Some folks prefer to learn about their civil rights obligations through that training, and again, once you review all these materials and if you have specific questions about your grant award and compliance or the services that you're providing, I encourage you to reach out to us. We're happy to help in any way that we can. And thank you for having me today. I believe our next presenter is going to be Chris Ash. I think it looks like we're going to hold questions to the end. So thank you again and welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tammy. I hope that you can all hear me okay. My name is Chris Ash, and my pronouns are they, them, and I am the Survivor Leadership Program Manager at the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking. And I'm very excited to be here with you. Just a little on my background. I am, in addition to being a survivor of human trafficking, I also have done work in direct services and crisis response, working directly with survivors of all forms of sexual violence, and have done some other community organizing. So next slide. I think what we're going to talk about now is just why. Why do we want to really focus on non-discrimination? Because there are instances where even if you're being compliant with the letter of the guidelines, that you may still not be creating a welcoming and safe environment for all survivors to be in your care. And I know that the people who are here with good hearts, but we all know that we have seen people in our careers at different points who have worked extra hard to find some loopholes and ways they can show that they're meeting the guidelines, but without having that heart for acceptance and inclusivity that helps people genuinely feel safe and able to do some of the work and start to ease up, right, some of the tension that trafficking may have created in their lives. So the reason we're here, my part of the presentation, is really going to get y'all focusing on thinking about why we want to do non-discrimination practices. Why does this change outcomes? Why is it so important, especially with survivors of human trafficking? So this is a picture I got out of a really wonderful stock photo collection called Disabled in Here. There are several different inclusive stock photo collections out there, inclusive and diverse stock photo collections, and I encourage you to use those in your trainings and presentations and materials. But the description they offered at Disabled in Here is: a Black non-binary person with a short mohawk and tattoos sits on a chair in front of a yellow backdrop while holding a black cane. So I want you thinking about this person, and if they were a survivor coming into your program, share in the chat, what do you think some of the concerns they might have had, right? Think about these practices on the human level. What concerns might this person have coming into your program? And obviously, they're going to have a lot of the same concerns any other survivors have. Any other new people coming in, will I be accepted? I'm kind of nervous. Can I trust anyone? There you go. So I'm seeing in the chat, and if someone, the chat's moving super quickly for me, but I'm going to try to scroll up and see some of these. So I am seeing concerns about being misgendered. Is the place accessible? Is there accessibility in your meeting space? Am I going to be accepted the way that I am? Yeah, are there steps that lead into the housing unit or important program places? Am I safe? And when we talk about safety, we're not just talking about from other staff, we're thinking from other residents too. Am I going to be safe in this space? Concerns about historical issues and systems or being just warehoused, not being considered as an individual, right? Am I coming here so that I have somewhere safe to go and can receive treatment and begin a healing process or a new stage in my healing process? Or am I just coming here to get filtered? You know, it can feel sometimes, and I know all of us have probably felt this in different areas of our lives. So even if you're not a survivor of trafficking, you may have had those moments possibly at like the DMV or a very large medical clinic where you could just be anybody. You're getting filtered like cattle through their steps without any attention to what your unique needs are. And then just amplify that times the amount of vulnerability someone coming in out of a trafficking situation might be feeling. These things have real impacts. Am I going to be considered an individual? Am I going to receive victim blaming? Is someone going to take a look at me and think, this person did something, or they're clearly the kind of person, and I'm saying this with sarcasm, you know, this is the kind of person who probably did something, and so we want to be clear that we're not being victim blamed. They might be worrying about representation. Am I the only Black person in this building? You know, are all of the staff people that are here not looking like me? Am I going to fit in? Are people going to be making treatment decisions about me who don't look like me and don't know anything at all about what I might have been through? You know, even with the clients, a lot of times, depending on the kind of program you're running, you may have clients that aren't very representative as well. They may be thinking, can I trust these people? Can I open up? Am I going to say something revealing a vulnerability that's going to get used against me later in some sort of fussing at me or whatever? Will I have privacy? Right? That can be something that's a big issue, especially when we're thinking about gender and being non-binary, or if someone is trans, will I have access to privacy when I'm changing clothes? But that privacy can be really big for anyone with a disability as well. How will I have privacy around having my physical needs met and still have some degree of privacy around that? Let me keep scrolling. Will I have a roommate or will I have my own space? Yes. What if I get a roommate and they are some combination of racist or transphobic or judgmental in some other way? How will I fit in then? Because this is more than just a roommate maybe judging you because you snore. This is a roommate judging you for something that's an inherent part of who you are. And that probably feels pretty tender because some other people in your history have judged you for it or treated you poorly for it. Are they going to think I'm not as smart as them, or am I going to be judged? Yes. Okay. So we all know that it's almost like a trope where someone talks to someone who either has limited English proficiency or some sort of hearing impairment or whatever. They have some sort of assumptions about you. And it might be that they have racist assumptions about you or assumptions about what your disability means to you. And then they say something to you and you ask for a clarification, and instead they just repeat the same thing back to you, slow and loud and very aggressively articulated, as if that solves the issue. You know, those are things that when you do them can just be like little things that signal to that person that they're not safe in this space. Are they going to be culturally competent? right? So even in spaces that don't have as much representation as they should, which we all should be working towards having staff, and not just like staff on not just third shift staff, but like our leadership. Who are our leadership in the organizations? Do people at all levels of our organization, on the ground, in the shelters, in our leadership, do they look like and have some of the same cultural and ability issues as some of our clients coming in? But even while we're working on getting to that, we can still build our cultural competence. We can build our capacity through providing training and reflective sessions for our staff to learn more about these issues. Do they have non-gendered spaces for me? Living, restrooms? Are they going to be culturally responsive? Right. So these are all things this person might be thinking about. And I want to remind you, with all of these concerns this person has, I want you to think about your program and your shelter, any housing or shelter program that you are part of. And I want you to think about what kinds of issues in your program specifically might be challenging to meet this person's needs. It might be an issue of if you house people according to gender, then how do you support this person in having a placement that feels good and safe to them? You want to think about these different issues that they have, issues around ability, issues around racism, issues around gender. And if you ask yourself which one of these concerns is more important to this person, A, that's for them to decide. They might be able to reflect back to you what their priorities are, but B, these concerns are all interconnected, right? When we think about, if you've ever heard someone talk about intersectionality, something that blew my mind about intersectionality is the explanation when someone explained to me that it's not about additive. It's not an additive definition of intersectionality where it increases with each one. It's that people with different identities experience different kinds of marginalization because of their other identities. So an example of this, these really compound vulnerability, there's been research that shows that people who have disabilities have a higher cumulative probability of being arrested. People with disabilities are more likely to be arrested than people without. But when you add in race and ethnicity into that analysis, you found out that the highest is Black people who have disabilities have significantly higher than either people with disabilities or Black people alone, because these things amplify and intersect with each other. So this person's not going to be able to separate out their identities or their experiences or their concerns and be able to tell you about them each separately. These things are each issues. They're going to experience it differently because some of the assumptions, for example, about Black people or other people of color are amplified in different ways, where from someone who is white and has a disability. Someone who has racist assumptions may see this person and assume that there is something this person did, or that it's not as bad, or that maybe it's something they did that is having them in this situation, in a way that they wouldn't be as quick to make those assumptions about white people who have disabilities. And so this person has probably had a pretty amplified and unique experience of marginalization that's then been amplified by their trafficking, right? So next slide. So with here, there was a survey, a US transgender survey that was done in 2015. And I'm going to use this survey to give y'all some examples of how discrimination impacts marginalized survivors. And there's other surveys from different populations and different identities. But I want to show you just kind of how these intersecting identities can amplify the amount of harm that someone experiences. So of this sample, a huge sample of transgender individuals in the United States, they found that 26% of the respondents who were homeless in the past year avoided staying in homeless shelters because they feared they would be mistreated. And beyond that, 6% were denied access. And for 4% of the people who were denied access, they were specifically told it was because of being transgender. Of the ones who stayed in the shelter, 70% of them reported some form of mistreatment, and over half of them said that they had been verbally harassed or attacked or sexually assaulted because of being transgender. Some of them got into a shelter and a safe placement for themselves without disclosing that they were transgender, only to be thrown out. 9% were thrown out once the shelter staff found out they were trans. And of the ones who were not thrown out, 44% decided to leave anyway because they didn't feel safe. And a quarter of them decided to present as the wrong gender to feel safe. And I just want to name to you that if your gender accommodation is that we will house transgender people as long as they detransition or present as the wrong gender while they're here, that's still discriminatory. That's still something that will make them feel unsafe, and especially when you consider that not being fully able to live as the right gender and seen that way in your communities is associated with significantly higher rates of suicide among transgender individuals. Next slide. And this is where, just to give you an idea of how these different identities intersect with each other, this is where they broke down of the people who experienced any housing discrimination or instability in the past year that was directly related to being transgender among the transgender women who responded to this massive survey. When they broke it down by race, if you look here, you can clearly see that race then amplifies the discrimination they're experiencing by virtue of being transgender. And I'm sure that being transgender amplifies the racial discrimination that they experience. These things add on to each other, but they also just kind of change the shape of how it happens. Next slide. So I want to remind you, this isn't just about checking a box. I know for me, sometimes when there's requirements, maybe it's because of my inherent resistance to authority. I can be a little bit of a problem child when I feel very strongly about one of my values. But it's not just about checking a box, because sometimes if I think it's just about checking a box, I'm less likely to be careful and thoughtful about the way I do things. And so I think it's important to remind us that these non-discrimination practices, they don't just help you check the box and keep your funding, they actually make your program more successful, right? So policies, and I have practices starred because having a non-discrimination policy is a first step. What we really want to be doing is implementing non-discrimination practices, right? Because having a policy, it's not going to be ineffective unless it's implemented. And those practices create success and foster healing for survivors in your program. And you want to think about how this creates success. So I'm going to ask some of y'all if you want to share in the chat, what are some things we stand to gain when we work to implement the spirit of non-discrimination in addition to meeting our legal and contractual requirements? What does it mean to be welcoming, and what do we gain when we as providers are welcoming to survivors of all backgrounds? Yeah, so someone says survivors are able to show up as their whole self. And I can guarantee you that for most survivors that I've ever known, and especially for those who have one or more marginalized identities on top of that, there's not that many spaces they can show up as their whole self, right? Let's see, someone is saying that you get to have a clear and calm conscience. Yeah. For those of you, one of the things people who work closely with me know that my integrity is really important to me, and I want to know that I'm trying to do right by the people I'm showing up for. And you get to have that sense of knowing that you really have shown up with integrity and done the best you can. You can learn so much about other people, their strengths and their cultures. That's something that's really interesting to me, is this beautiful idea of like a learning share just from being in the presence of each other, right? We don't have to interrogate someone else about their culture or their background or their identities. If we're safe people and we're working to create welcoming environments to the best of our ability, people are going to feel free to bring their whole selves to that space, and through being our whole selves in shared community with other people who are free to be their whole selves, we're going to have that learning exchange just by virtue of showing up and being present with each other. Successful businesses and institutions, yeah, we're going to be successful because here's the thing. We talked earlier about representation. If someone who holds one or more marginalized identities comes to work for you, and maybe they start moving into a middle management position, or they're at your agency, anywhere on the rung in terms of leadership, if they're coming in with these identities and it's really normalized in your organization to sort of like try to find loopholes or just meet the letter of the law without really creating a welcoming and inclusive environment, it's probably not a welcoming and inclusive environment for them as an employee either, right? So we're going to have high rates of turnover. We're going to struggle to keep people on who have their hearts really in this work because we're not creating a welcoming environment overall, right? That culture doesn't just impact our clients and residents and survivors. That culture impacts our employees and our teams and our relationships with our community. So we'll be more successful if we're implementing this in a way that has integrity. Someone says delivery of services might become easier and more effective. Yes, you might find one of the things that's really common, and I'm going to be honest, trafficking survivors can sometimes be resistant or scared or have trust issues. As you know, sometimes we are not the easiest people because we don't really know if we can trust you yet. But what happens is as you create this community of care and this culture of inclusivity and welcoming, then what you see is that people see they can trust you more, and some doors get opened in terms of supporting someone's healing that would have been closed, would have been brick walls to you before, because you're creating a different environment. You're going to be more effective. We gain dignity. We are not our sister's keeper, we are our sister. Where there's discrimination or marginalization, it will come back around to me at some point. So I must be a fighter for justice and equality. I love that. Someone said that in the chat, and it reminds me of the quote that, we fight for each, and I'm getting the quote wrong, but we fight for each other's liberation because your liberation is tied up in mine, right? Thank you. Someone's saying this resonates with their workplace. We grow and evolve. We co-create a more loving world in spite of our initial sense of discomfort to those who don't look, talk, dress like us. Modeling positive relationships, healthy relationships. Absolutely. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of resonance in that, right? So this actually makes us better. It makes our program more effective. And the other thing I will say is it helps reduce gaps. I was a technical assistance provider at a statewide agency before coming to my current position. And I regularly, and maybe you hear this a lot, where someone calls and they're trying to find a shelter placement for someone who has a lot of challenges and a lot of these identities and experiences that mean that they need a different kind of placement. And it's a gap. You're like, yeah, that's actually a gap. There's not that many agencies that can provide competent shelter for that person. When you start to implement these non-discrimination practices, you're filling gaps in your community, in your state, by becoming a place that people who have these identities can feel more present and safe in. So next slide. This is a scenario that I wanted to offer you. A young Black transgender woman is staying in a shelter for women. When she meets with her case manager, she reports that other residents are harassing her, calling her he or him, and taunting her by calling her Danny Boy because her name is Danielle. You come into work in the morning to find that during the night she threatened to beat up other residents. Overnight staff wrote it up as grounds for ejection. The resident indicated that it was in response to continued misgendering, but the overnight staff say they didn't hear anything like that. And this is sort of a composite. I used to get a call, some variation of this call every month, every couple of months when I was working as a technical assistance provider. So first, let's just start and say, what do you notice in this story? What do you notice in the story that either resonates with things you might have seen in the past, or that you think might have contributed to this dynamic developing? Staff not wanting to pick sides. Yeah. So that is something that happens a lot, staff. And I just want to remind you that a lot of times when we don't want to take sides in our interactions, especially between like, in your everyday conflict, because you don't want to be managing every conflict for your residents. But when you don't take a side, when it's an issue of discrimination or oppression or harassment like that, you are taking a side, right? If we see harassment or violence happening, not taking a side is taking a side. So just kind of naming that can be helpful. Staff not being able to call in the person who is misgendering the other guest, right? So the staff aren't telling this person, they aren't able to like name this and work with that person in a way that kind of puts an end to it or lets them know it's not acceptable. Maybe there's some bias on the part of some of the staff. Even the complaint may not have been shared with the overnight staff to make them aware of potential issues within the shelter. That's a good thing to point out because it might be easy to assume, when I brought situations like this up with a friend who ran shelters, one of the things she said was that, overnight staff sometimes miss a lot of things, but I think it's important to be like, hey, are they missing it because we're just not filling them in? What is our communication policy when we're working with clients to make sure that all the people working are aware of these dynamics so they can address them? They may think it is easier to kick her out than having to have a conversation with the other clients. Yeah, and I'm sure that y'all have seen this dynamic happening. We're seeing it in the news, you see it in the media. It's very common for people who are really struggling and in cultures where aggression and harassment are normalized, when they're told they can't harass somebody anymore, to claim that they're being harassed. Now I'm being oppressed because I can't harass this person anymore. And so it might be that they're afraid of getting that kind of pushback or things kind of blowing up or becoming really confrontational or challenging to manage if they have to have that conversation. Someone in here is saying we should always believe survivors when they report discrimination. Yes, and someone saying there's the old trope about angry Black woman or people. Sometimes if you stand up for yourself, they perceive you as angry. And I want to just name, okay, so that comment is a really wonderful example, a horrible example of something that happens, but a really good example for illustrating intersectionality. Because already if we have a Black woman who is mad or upset about something and standing up for herself, we have this angry Black woman discriminatory trope. But when you add in the transgender, then it gets layered on top of it with now you're especially not what ladylike. Now you're really unfeminine, and it's probably because you're not even a real woman. So it's that they experience like this amplified layers of discrimination. So the angry Black woman stereotype layered onto a transgender woman who's already having her femininity questioned can really cause some, you especially can be scared of how you're going to be perceived if you're standing up for yourself, right? There's these intersections. That's a perfect illustration of intersectional oppression. We're seeing in here, someone's mentioning a need for more effective communication among staff, right? So how do we have this communication? Someone is saying staff might consider her dangerous now, right? And again, this is where some of that intersectionality comes into play, because she's now on the receiving end of both racial assumptions about Black women who stand up for themselves, and also on the end of gendered assumptions and fear of transgender people, where now I've got this violent person who's on the receiving end of a lot of different assumptions, right? Someone says not validating her experience, whether or not the staff heard it, right? And this is the other thing, is even if the overnight staff didn't hear it, the case manager's already been hearing all along. This person has reported to me that this is happening. The case manager already knows this is a pattern, so we could be aware of it. Also, then, if that staff was potentially by themselves and not well trained to address this, that's something where I want to have a lot of compassion for all staff, because I really do think that if someone really, I think that sometimes there can be selective hearing especially if that staff person is not super inclusive or trans friendly to begin with. But I also think there might be situations where someone really didn't hear that. I didn't hear the comment. And so that could be something to where you'll want to train people on some of these dynamics of how some of the harassment happens, and how that can impact the client staying in your shelter. Make sure you're giving them plenty of training and support around that. Have a protocol in place for how to respond to these kinds of situations. Because a lot of times what happens is that the friction is not always between the staff person and the client. It might be between residents in the same shelter who are both clients. And so how do we handle it when there is a discriminatory form of behavior or harassment between residents? Because we have to have a policy for that, right? And a way to implement it. Some staff will turn the other cheek, yes, and expect that the client does the same. Staff may not know what misgendering is or sounds like. That is so important to remember. So letting them know what it is, some examples of what it may sound like, and also what its impacts are, right? It can make someone definitely not feel safe staying in a shelter. It can increase suicidality. There's a lot of different impacts of misgendering. So you want to make sure they're trained on what it is, what it might sound like, what it might look like, and also why it's important to address it, because that's something that happens a whole lot. Yeah, you end up being complicit. Thank y'all so much for all of this reflection on that. And so I want to encourage you to think, and I might move on to the next slide because the next slide gets into some of our actual things we can do, but think, what are some ways that we could put something into place to prevent these kinds of things from happening in the future? I'd love for you to take that home with you and maybe have conversations in your shelter about what can we put in place to ensure that we are both meeting the letter of the requirements for our grant funding and our contracts, but that we're also creating a welcoming environment. What do we put in place to prevent that? So I do have a few other considerations I've brought up, and then at the end I'm going to give y'all a space to kind of bring up other considerations or questions that you might have. But one of the things that comes up, some other considerations on the next slide that come up for me are, you might want to review your policies and protocols. Take time to go through your protocols and policies. You're going to check them, all of your policies and protocols, against legal and grant requirements for non-discrimination. So some examples of that might be if you have, and I know that Tammy gave y'all some good examples of that. You might have a policy in place that you don't realize is discriminatory, so double check all of those. But then go through and check all your protocols and policies for bias or inequity or indirect impacts, and develop a strategy for structural program change. So you might not be able to you may have some things that you want to implement that are going to create a welcoming and inclusive and non-discriminatory environment. And you may think, well, we can't do that because right now clients are required to do this and this, and our physical building is only such and such. But go ahead and start thinking, what would structural program change look like to create a whole different way of doing this that's inherently equitable and inclusive? You're going to want to partner with community organizations in your review and restructuring. So if you're reviewing your policies, if you're considering what restructuring of some of the programs, some of the programmatic pieces that are problematic, and you're trying to think about what the restructure might look like, you're going to want to bring in community organizations. And I want to pause on that one and ask y'all, what are some of the community organizations that you might want to partner with on these reviews? I could name maybe a local LGBTQ center might be an option, or if you have a statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization, you might want to see if there are DEI, and that's diversity, equity, and inclusivity experts who can kind of like go through your programs and look for things. I did a training recently One of the partners I brought in was a local university has an institute on developmental disabilities, and I had them review my training and content and give me feedback to make sure that it's not like this is our anti-discrimination policy and then here's what we do for people with disabilities. They actually went through and helped us really restructure and be like, here are pieces in your overall protocol with where people with different kinds of disabilities may have challenges or need special accommodations, so we could change our policy to be to have more of a universal design way of thinking about it. Someone is mentioning local LGBTQIA agencies and clubs, local legal groups that know about specific laws and rights, minority group organizations, right? And these people that you bring in, these organizations, pay them, write them into your grant, write this kind of stuff into some of your grants, and then bring them in, hire them as consultants to give you however many hours of review of your policies. If you want to have a working group, pay them to come to your working group meetings and help give input. These are ways that you can make sure you're not just relying on your staff's base of knowledge, because again, your staff may or may not be representative of the communities you're working with. Volunteer lawyers network, yeah. Tribal communities, that's a really good one. And depending on what state you're in, many of your states actually have some sort of tribal commission, but tribal communities and leaders and elders facilitate a peer-based training, people from the LGBTQ community, survivors. Yeah, so these are all things you'll want to do. And I just want to add, again, one of the things that happens is we end up with predominantly white organizations whose leadership are not representative, who we want to be really careful not to get into an extractive way of working with them. We want to make sure we're doing a collaborative way of working with them. And that's going to involve both respecting their wisdom and expertise, but also compensating them appropriately, because you wouldn't want to work for free for somebody. So don't expect them to. Pay them, work it, write it into your grants, write it into your budget. Religious organizations. I'm so glad you named that. That would be a really good thing, right? Cool. So, and then ensure that all your staff receive ongoing professional development, support, and accountability. And this is the thing. If I were supervising that staff person that said they didn't hear it, I don't want to like yell at them or make them feel horrible for not catching it, but we're going to have some conversations, and I'm going to be looking at how I can better support that staff person, right? What does accountability look like in that kind of situation? Next slide. So you're also going to want to review your policies around involuntary exits with regard to how bias or discrimination might contribute to disproportionate rates of rates or impacts of exits, right? Oh, and someone in there in terms of our partnerships and organizations has people of color led orgs for sure. Absolutely agree. But think about the fact that with discrimination, that can not only lead to increased rates or disproportionate rates of involuntary exits, but the impacts of the exits might be disproportionate. They might be higher for these people who don't have access to other services, who might have even fewer options available to them. You're going to want to think about whether or not your grievance procedures are very clearly articulated, and how do they find out? Not just we have a grievance policy, we put it out there, they sign it on day one when they come in and they're overwhelmed, and we have this grievance policy, and maybe they remember it and maybe they don't. But like, how do we share know your rights information with the survivors? Do they know that they can file a grievance even after their housing or shelter exit? Making sure that if you do have to do an exit, that you are building up some resources for that person instead of just booting them, right? Like, we're going to build up resources. We're going to let you know as you're leaving, here's how you can file a grievance. Even after your exit, here are some resources that we can give you. You know, if you have to exit someone, then make sure you're leaving them with supports and that you're giving them opportunities for recourse if they have been treated in a discriminatory fashion. So think through, know your rights. Are your rights posted in an accessible way, not a whole wall of legalese? I know sometimes I go into my workplace and in the break room, they have the your rights as an employee on the wall. I don't read that thing because it's like a whole poster full of tiny font in legal jargon. So do you have like a really clear know your rights that's accessible, that's available and reiterated with them? And then also consider the role of staff implicit bias in note-taking, screening, and monitoring. Obviously, you're going to want to do some implicit bias trainings with staff and help them understand how that can impact the way that they make assumptions about different people. But as a supervisor or in leadership, you're going to want to make sure that as you're reading through notes, as you're reading through screening results, make sure that you're aware that sometimes that bias can show up in the way we perceive people. And so to just kind of be double checking yourself for that, have like a second layer of support for those, to check for those. Next slide. So if discriminatory behavior occurs between residents, not just between a resident and a staff person, but it's between residents and goes unchecked, it can create unsafe environments. So I want you to make sure that you have a policy in place for mitigating harm in those situations. And how do you train, support, and monitor your staff on being consistent in their responses to that? Again, like, I think we think a whole lot about like how we as staff don't treat clients in discriminatory ways. But we know that when we have people come into our shelters, they're going to bring their biases and their experiences and their backgrounds in with them. And so make sure that we are capable of developing and implementing practices to mitigate discriminatory bias between residents, but also at all levels of your agency structure. So think about things like the crisis line, walk-in support, screening, service access. Walk through your program from the perspective of a survivor, from the time you get in first contact with them to the time that they would leave, and think, what are the steps where that bias and discriminatory culture can impact the way this person experiences this step. And then always remember there's a difference between paper and practice. So think about not just what policy is written, but what do you actually do? What do you do? What happens in your program to foster as safe an environment as possible once someone is in your care, once someone is in your doors, once someone is dependent on you in that moment for their housing and their board and so many of their needs to be met? What are you doing to create as safe an environment as possible? And next slide, just in closing, before opening it up to questions, I just want to name that non-discrimination practices, they not only make you more effective and help you fill gaps, but they also honor courage. Because if you think about any of these people that we've kind of used as composites in our story, and I'm sure you probably are also thinking about different clients and survivors you may have worked with in your history. It's really terrifying to come into a program from having had a really vulnerable experience like trafficking. And you think about the fact that for many of these people, systems have already failed them. Even before they were ever trafficked, they probably already had systems fail them and not show up for them in the way they could. And then you come into this not knowing if you're going to be treated well. That's like superhero level bravery right there. Just to walk in your door takes a huge amount of courage and vulnerability. And we want you to keep your money and to follow the laws of the grant requirements for your funding by consistently implementing and strengthening your non-discrimination practices. But more than that, we want to fill gaps, and we want to ensure that every survivor has a fair chance at safety and healing. And for me, that's what the non-discrimination practices are about, is making sure that every survivor has a fair and equitable chance at safety and healing in your program. And I think we can go to questions now.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris and Tammy, for really some amazing content and great information coming through. So just want to encourage everyone, as you are thinking of questions, feel free to drop those into our Q&A box. We have about 8 minutes to get through some of these. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started with some of these great questions that are coming through our Q&A box. Chris, I'm going to direct our first question towards you. That really is starting with the heart of this conversation around bias and discrimination. So, what do you think are some good places to start, or some good first steps for organizations that are really looking to learn more and work towards anti-bias and anti-racist and just anti-bias work in general? What are some good places to start?
There's two things. I think the first place to start is just some internal work. And that might involve maybe doing finding some sort of inventory about like what some of your practices are. How are you treating your staff? How are you consistently implementing non-discrimination practices with your employees? Like, do some of that internal work first, because that'll create the culture shift that will then flow over into how you work with your clients. There's nothing more infuriating than an agency that claims to be trying to do like anti-violence work that has a really harmful work culture for people with marginalized identities. And then I would say that you'll want to offer your staff like some basic trainings, get them engaged in learning about different populations to where they're learning how to go beyond. Like, we want to meet the minimum requirements of the law, but that we want to do trainings on like how to LGBTQ pronouns and language that people might use, and special needs in a housing setting. We want to do trainings about universal design, right? So I don't know if y'all have heard of universal design, but that's where instead of waiting on someone to bring up a disability accommodation they need, we try to incorporate awareness of accommodations into all of our programming so that people don't have to ask for them. These are things where you can just go get some basic training on it. And I would say then, once you've done your basic training, you've done some internal work, that would be a really good time to really start strengthening your relationships with local organizations that are culturally specific and LGBTQ. Because if you don't do some of that internal work first, on your internal policies and procedures and on your staff basic knowledge, you're going to put your foot in it pretty quickly when you start interacting with those community orgs. And so that way you're not asking them to do too much of the work for you. You're getting a good start on some trainings.
Tammy, this next question that came in is for you. And I'm going to summarize the question. So for who asked this question, this doesn't fully encapsulate it. But the question is really around service animals and emotional support animals in congregate settings, meaningful access. Find survivors who are accessing those shelter, transitional housing programs who may have emotional support animals or service animals. Could you maybe provide just some context around what that may look like, especially from that legal aspect?
Sure. Thanks for the question. It's actually a good one. I can't speak for emotional service animals because they aren't provided legal protections under Title II or Section 504 of the ADA. Both of those laws specifically specify service animals, which is defined as a dog or, in some cases, when appropriate, a miniature horse. And so if an individual is accessing your DOJ-funded services and this individual has a disability for which they require a service animal, then they need to be afforded access to the facility, its services, programs, and benefits, just as if they were an individual without that disability that required that service animal. In the law, in a quick case law search, we generally see this kind of collision between a group setting and service animals, and then blending the individual with the disability requiring the service animal into this group setting. And as you can imagine, college dormitories. Probably one of the most known cases was two individuals. They were freshmen meeting up for the first time during their freshman year. They were partnered in their living assignment, and the one individual was an individual with a disability requiring the need for a service dog, and the other individual was severely allergic to pet dander. This immediately created a problem where both had a medical condition documented as a disability. However, both of those individuals needed to be accommodated under the law to ensure that neither were discriminated against based on their disability. In that scenario, an equitable housing arrangement was reached for both students, that each could still continue to receive all of the same program services or benefits that they would have received through the initial housing assignment, and therefore neither were treated differently because of their disability that required the service animal.
Question for you as well, just around where programs can find more information or find support just around fair housing law information, if you have any information about that.
Thanks for the question. My office actually has no legal jurisdiction over the fair housing law, and so I couldn't advise on that or where additional information could be sought for that. I'm sorry about that. That's just not something that we have any legal enforcement over.
But looking through, and we are almost at time. So thank you all so much, everyone, for submitting those questions. We will be sending out in our follow-up email just some additional answers for any questions we didn't get through today. And also, if you have any questions but didn't have a chance to drop them in our Q&A box, feel free to reach out directly to our presenters as well, and they'd be more than happy to provide some information as well. So just as a reminder, a copy of today's recording will be sent out in the next within the next 2 weeks, along with a copy of today's slide deck and all of the resource materials that have been linked. So thank you all so much for coming. As you close today's webinar, an evaluation link will pop up automatically, which we would really appreciate you all filling out. And so that concludes today's presentation. Again, thank you all so much for coming. Hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.